والله يدعو إلى دار السلام ويهدي من يشاء إلى صراط مستقيم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Ramadan, the blessed month that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed the believers by such a beautiful month in which they would acquire more and more of the good deeds and change their lives by being obedient servants to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the great qualities that we acquire in the month of Ramadan is the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts of the believers. This love that would make the believers give their life and all of what they have for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's such a level that the believers reaches it. They reach it by being obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that the believers, they love from all ways and forms, because He's the creator, He's the provider, He's the sustainer. He's the one that provides for His servants the endless bounties from Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as a sign of the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts of the believers is when they are obedient to Him, when they follow the way of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِ يُحْبِبُكُمُ اللَّهِ. Say, if you love Allah, then follow me. Meaning follow the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allah would love you. It is very important to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what is more important is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would love us. Most of the people on earth, they claim that they love Allah, that they love the creator of the heavens and the earth. But do Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love all of them? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those who are obedient to Him, those who fulfill the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who fulfill the purpose of their creation. And this verse in Surah Al Imran shows that following the way of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is the way for the believers to acquire the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are many acts of worship in the month of Ramadan that brings the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts of the believers. One of which is a sign that the believers love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is when the person prefers to do the things that is loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more than what his own self would desire. We desire to eat and drink, necessities in our life, but we abstain from it throughout the day of the month of Ramadan. For what purpose? For the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. If a person hides and eats, nobody can see him. And that's why it's an act of worship that needs sincerity. And when the person abstains from eating and drinking, the necessities of his life, then this is a sign of the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts of the believers. Because they prefer and they do the acts of worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love, even though if it's against to their own desires. So this is a good quality for us to acquire in the month of Ramadan. For us to ponder whenever we feel the hunger and the thirst throughout the day in the month of Ramadan, we remember that we do this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. It's not because of the culture or because of health reasons. We do this seeking the rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those who are fasting, the fasting individuals. And the goodness of fasting comes back onto the same individual. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most rich. He is in no need of our own acts of worship. We are the ones that are in need of it. It purifies our hearts. It makes us having in our hearts the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was said also that a sign of those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when they give their whole self, their desires, their needs, their time, their wealth, all of what they have for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does that mean? It means they know that they have been created except for one reason, and that is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So their time is being used for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Their physical power, it is being used to make the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala superior. We should not waste our precious moments of our life and the moments of the month of Ramadan in things that would not bring any benefit to ourselves or our communities. We need to fulfill the purpose of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is how the life of the Muslim is such a valuable one. So those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they give their time and their wealth, part of their wealth of course. And even when the person spends from his money on his own family, which most people do in the religion of Islam, we get rewarded if we do this. Far more rewards than giving your wealth to a poor person, for example, because this is an obligatory charity, an obligatory spending that we have to spend. We spend from our time to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to help others, to feed the needy and the poor, to make the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala superior, to benefit Muslims. This is a sign of the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the heart. Another thing that shows the sign of the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts is the recitation of the Quran. And this is a mean to acquire the love of Allah. The Quran is the word of Allah. There is no way for a person to know about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, to know what pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to have the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts, without reciting and pondering over the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. And this is the month of the Quran. This is the month when the Muslims, they open the Quran for them to change their life. It is not just in Ramadan, but also after Ramadan, at all times. We have this strong relationship between us and the book of Allah. We seek guidance by fulfilling the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is the opportunity for us to read and ponder over the verses of the Quran. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam used to recite the Quran in Ramadan more than in any other month. The companions radiallahu anhum would do the same way. The scholars of the religion of Islam, those who would give their time in teaching others the rulings and the matters of knowledge, they would leave, some of them, like Imam Malik rahimahullah, he would leave teaching the people the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Ramadan, so that he is busy reciting the Quran, which is an act of worship that we do a lot in the month of Ramadan, that brings the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts, because it's the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So by doing the recitation of the Quran, it brings the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hearts, and we need to acquire this, because we are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can never have any superiority in this life or in the hereafter. We can never have any joy or happiness. We can never fulfill anything except by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The believers, they have the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their hearts, and they seek that from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the dua of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He used to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bring the love of Allah in the hearts of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. The love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that we acquire in the month of Ramadan by doing the acts of worship. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changes the hearts of the believers. As the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, that the hearts are in between two fingers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He changes it the way He likes subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He used to say alayhi salatu wasalam, one of the most frequent dua, supplication of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he would say, Allahumma muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinik. O Allah, the one that changes the hearts, make my heart steadfast on your religion. So for us to have the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our hearts, it's by the will and the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we seek the mean of such a thing by the acts of worship in Ramadan, by making dua, by recitation of the Quran, by choosing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves over what our desires would want us to make. It is a blessing for the believers to fast and to pray throughout the month of Ramadan. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.